In the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man, Sri Aurobindo is leading us into a deeper understanding of how the spiritual being emerges out of the mental being. As is Sri Aurobindo's approach, he goes to the very core of the whole knowledge and process of evolution and of nature. In many ways, what he describes here is so essential that if we understand this thoroughly, we can understand everything that happens in evolution at every level, at all stages. Looking back, first he showed us the difference between the mental consciousness and the spiritual, what distinguishes a spiritual emergence from a merely mental purificatory preparation. And then as he moves into the actual evolutionary process, he first reminds us that it is nature which has been leading the process. And so you cannot understand the evolutionary process unless you understand nature's intention and what she wants to do and how she chooses to do it. And already we have seen two broad truths of this exploration, and we will now come into a third. The first broad truth is that nature has a double evolution. There is an evolution of the instrumental nature, and then there's the evolution of the soul, and the two have to support each other. Necessarily, the inner consciousness evolving must depend on the nature and the instrumental evolution for its expression. Equally, instrumental nature cannot evolve unless the inner grows sufficiently to be able to push it to evolve. And that makes for a bit of a struggle, which we understood leads often to the haste of the inner consciousness that says, I'm going to push back on nature, trample upon it, even get rid of it in order to be able to surge forward and not have to wait. But even in that attempt to surge forward, it's nature which meets that forward movement by saying, well, if you want to express this, you need me. And so inevitably we come back to this double movement. This is the first big idea. The second big idea was, which we have covered so far, is that nature pushes forward in the preparation or the opening to the inner and spiritual dimension through four streams, or he says 4 lines of development, which we saw were religion, occultism, spiritual thought, and spiritual experience. We dwelt on each of these 4 and saw how they have complex relationships between them. Sometimes each of these takes support of the others, sometimes it turns against the others. But inevitably the first 3 find their fulfillment in the 4th, which is the experience. The experience itself draws on the other 3 to fix itself more completely into the nature, to make the experience itself more complete. Religion is used by the experiential movement to deepen the relationship with the divine powers and the one divine being, cosmic or universal or transcendent even. Equally, it uses occultism as a way of deepening the knowledge of other realms, other parts and layers of consciousness. It uses also spiritual thought for bridging from the experiential to the mind and the rational consciousness and turning it to application. All of this broadly represents the second great truth of evolution in nature. We now come to the third great truth. And as we will see in a separate discussion once we understand this once he reveals this in the next paragraph, we will look back and see how these three great truths actually give you an insight into all operations of nature on all levels in evolution. So we come now to the third truth. He says, in the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding. For each new principle that evolves its powers has to make its way out of an involution in inconscience and ignorance. So, the third great truth is that any emergence in evolution, whether it is the spiritual being out of the mental, or mental being out of the life being, or life out of matter, or any of the in-between stages, or any of the combinations, always it has to proceed at first by a slow unfolding. And the reason for that being that the new principle has to make its way out of an involution. There was an involution by which that principle had been bound into the lower. Now it has to make its way out of it, but also out of its involution in inconscience and ignorance. And as a result, the first emergence is very slow. Once the first emergence has been made slowly, then there is a faster emergence where it comes into its own, and then there is a more rapid development of its possibilities. It actually goes through 3 stages. Now, all of this knowledge he will elaborate in the next one paragraph. And we will see it is extremely condensed, compact, and profound knowledge. And if we can really grasp this, you will be able to look at any situation in the world, in human society, in various cultures and civilizations, at various stages of their development, where something new is emerging out of the old, and you will understand why it is the way it is, and what nature is doing, and what those 3 stages are, and what are the issues in each of these 3 stages which make for that stage to become difficult, or which make for that stage to become complete. The whole thing is compressed, condensed into one paragraph, which if you read casually, you will say, it is a more poetical description of things, but it's a very precise scientific description, as we will see. So in the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding. In the very nature of things, what things? The way reality is. The way reality is that everything originates from above. But from above, it involves, reduces itself to lower and more dense, more dark, more limited, more rigid substantiality. But hiding now the higher possibilities into this, all the way down to, he has used 2 words here, inconscience and ignorance. And the difference is very important. We will see in the process of emergence. So, as it goes darker, there is the passage where the consciousness, the awareness of what the principle is now involving, loses awareness of itself, does not even know what it is, and at that point it is ignorance. It has awareness, but it does not know itself entirely. It does not know itself truly. It knows something, but the thing which is known is so fragmented, so limited that it is incapable, even it is wrong in the way it knows itself. And that is the domain of ignorance. Ignorance is not lack of knowledge or awareness, it is partial knowledge or awareness and distorted knowledge and awareness. But from there, when it sinks further down, it becomes inconscience, where the consciousness itself is lost and the awareness is gone, and at that point it does not even know that it is. And everything that has to emerge must come out first out of inconscience into ignorance, and then come out of ignorance into some more complete consciousness, and then out of that come to its true consciousness. Our mind, for example, is ignorant, becoming more conscious. In the animal mind, you have only ignorance. You do not have consciousness having come into its own. In the human mind, it has come into its own that it can see, observing itself and say, oh, I am ignorant, which is a very big deal. It's a very big step in evolution. And so from being able to recognize its own ignorance, it is ready now to recognize what it needs which would overcome the ignorance. When I was 12 years old, in one of those magazines in Reader's Digest, I believe, I had read this thing which struck me very deeply. And I learnt it by heart, and it has stayed for life. A statement which goes like this: he who knows not, and knows not that he knows not, is a fool. Shun him. The fellow doesn't know, and he doesn't know that he doesn't know. He thinks he knows. He is a fool. Shun him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not is a child. Teach him. The fellow says, I'm aware that I don't know. So you're ready to learn. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep. Wake him. So the fellow actually has an awakening, but he is covered up by the confusions of society which tell him, you don't know, you are not right, you are incapable. And the fellow says, oh yeah, I cannot be like what society wants me to be, so I am incapable, I am incompetent. He actually knows something deeper, which is his true value of life, which he has now set aside. So he is asleep. Wake him to what he already knows. And the last, the fourth, he who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him. Very interesting formulation. When you have knowledge and it is true knowledge which recognizes its own truth, then of course there you follow. But this idea, this statement I'm placing as 4 stages of awakening in a sense. We're not mapping it to Sri Aurobindo's description, but the idea that there can be a stage where you don't even know that you don't know. In ignorance, there is not even awareness of your existence, much less of knowledge. In inconscience, in inconscience, there is not even awareness that you exist, or that there can be awareness. And so in inconscience, you're completely lost in darkness. Out of inconscience, you awaken to ignorance. Out of ignorance to something more, preparing the step for true knowledge, which is that passage of the current higher range of humanity. So, in the very nature of things, all evolution must proceed at first by a slow unfolding, because it has to struggle out from inconscience through ignorance to something where it can come into its own. And that whole initial process, everything is blocked. For each new principle that evolves its powers has to make its way out of an involution in inconscience and ignorance. So every new principle, he is not talking of the spiritual only, anything emerging anywhere at any stage must come out from these. Now you may say, how is the spiritual going to come out of inconscience and ignorance? Because it's coming out of mind. No, the rooting of spirit also has been in inconscience and ignorance into matter. And although it may come out of mind, its roots are still embedded in inconscience and ignorance. And it has to make its way out of that. So that's why he says each new principle, there you get a hint that what he is describing is for all principles, at all stages of evolution. So how does it make its way out of an involution, make its way out? It's as if you're inside some lost passage of a tunnel or a maze and you have to make your way out. Literally, the consciousness is so deeply bound that it cannot just come out. It doesn't even know what is out, that there is an out. So it moves, it tries, and it's like a zigzag until something feels, oh yeah, now it's a little more out. And then again zigzag and a little more out. Like a blind man trying to come out of a dark room or a dark maze, not even knowing that there is light. Until he begins to have the first glimpses of light which can help him now to navigate more directly. So make its way out is again a suggestion describing how that process takes place. And now he elaborates on this. He will describe broadly 3 stages of this emergence. And within each stage, he will describe the finer components of it. So the first stage, it has a no, before the first three stages, he summarizes the whole process of the three stages. Okay, this is where we are at now. It has a difficult task in pulling itself out of the involution, out of the hold of the obscurity of the original medium, against the pull and strains, the instinctive opposition and obstruction of the inconscience, and the hampering mixture and blind, obstinate retardations of the ignorance. Broad description of how that emergence takes place, the pulling out, making its way out. And so within this already you find four aspects or four components. First, it has to pull itself out of the involution. It's a difficult task. How do you pull yourself out of involution? First, you got involved, perhaps willingly, you crashed into darkness in the involution. And you're stunned. And now out of that stunned darkness, you have to pull yourself out of involution. There's a very beautiful representation of this idea, which I have seen in some painting, but more recently in a statue, which is presented in a beautiful temple called Akshardham in Delhi, where in preparation for the video of their founder and his life's journey, they prepare you by making you aware that your life has to be chiseled out, really, to be made beautiful. But who's going to chisel you out? And then you see a big stone, and then it turns, and you see the head half emerging out of the stone, with one arm half emerged, the other arm still bound, and this half emerged arm has a hammer, and the other arm holding a little chisel, hammering the stone in which it is bound. Very interesting image. And this is represented perfectly in this description. How do you pull yourself out of inconscience, and the stone is inconscience? Some part of you should become sufficiently conscious and then able to actuate itself to be able to turn upon yourself and be able to chisel out. And when I was dwelling on that image, I was thinking, well, how much more does it represent? What is this arm, the right arm? What is the left arm? What is the hammer? What is the chisel? And I formulated it to myself in this way, that the hammer is your willpower. It hits. It persists in hitting. You want to change something? Well, your willpower is your hammer. The chisel, which directs the force of the hammer on a particular spot where you want to break the inconscience, that chisel is your concentration. So you concentrate your awareness on the thing you want to change, and then your will is like the hammer which acts. But the concentration is which directs the power of the will. Your right arm and your left arm. The right arm is active, the left arm is passive, holding. And you will recall Sri Aurobindo describing in the Synthesis of Yoga the right and left hand of the yoga. And don't remember now how exactly he formulates it, but one side which holds the active side and then the passive side, and these are the two things which move together to make for the result. I believe it was the power of I don't remember now exactly how he formulated it, but you have an active side and then a passive side, and this is how I represented in that image. But the idea still is this half-emerged consciousness now trying to pull itself out of stone, literally carving itself out by chipping away the things which bind it. So it has the difficult task in pulling itself out of the involution. And then what happens when it starts doing this? Out of the hold of the obscurity of the original medium. So you are as if, let's say, a human being who has now got embedded into the stone. Literally, you have become stoned, enstoned. encapsulated in the substantiality of stone, and that's the medium into which you're bound. Now, the wording is very suggestive when he says it has a difficult task in pulling itself out of the involution, out of the hold of obscurity of the original medium. What is this original medium? And by stating it in this way, the principle he describes can be applied everywhere. The original medium, the medium out of which you originate. Well, if you look at it from an absolute perspective, everything got involved all the way into inconscience, and that's the original medium. But it could equally apply to our current context, the mind emerging, the spiritual being emerging out of mind, mental being. That is now the medium out of which spirit has to emerge. Or mind emerging out of its original medium, which is life force, and so on. The wording makes it universal. You can apply it everywhere. Even it has physical implications. The original medium of all matter's emergence is what we would call the physical ether. And a particle emerging out of that amorphous ether is emerging out of its original medium to become individualized as a particle, to grow to become an atom, which Aurobindo describes as the first type of the ego, which resists opposition and change, to hold its individuality. So you take this line and understand it, appreciate it in its essentiality, and you look at any situation, you will see this principle operative, and all the rest of what he describes, how they work in any emergence of a higher principle out of a lower involution. So, out of the hold of the obscurity of the original medium, the obscurity holds, in this case, in the image we have seen, the original medium is the stone, and the chiseling is an emergence out of it. But the hold of the obscurity, the darkness, is actually gripping you, like the stone binds you into its darkness. So life force, when it emerged out of matter, was held and bound by matter, and the hold of the medium is dark. And now in the context of the spiritual emergence, our spiritual being emerging out of mental being is actually held back by the mental consciousness, or rooted in the inconscience and ignorance and its darkness, out of which it has to emerge. So this is the second aspect of it. Third aspect is against the pulls and strains. So every time that you pull yourself out, we can now change the image. We can describe ourselves as a human being which has fallen into semi-liquid tar, black, dark, inconscious, sticky. And if you were fully immersed in the tar, you wouldn't know which is up and down and out or in. But you have pulled, let's say, a part of your consciousness out, and now you're trying to pull the rest of you out. The stickiness, first there's the hold of the obscurity of the medium, and then against the pulls and strains. Literally the tar grips you and pulls you, and any movement of your emergence has to strain against that resistance of the pull and strain. This literally is how life force has come out of matter. Matter has pulled it and strained against any effort of life to emerge. So there's a pull back, and then there's a strain of the two pulls, one going upward, one pulling back downward. The strain and the pull are different things. The pull, if you do nothing, you'll fall back in. If at any point you've come out a little bit out of this quicksand of tar, if I have to mix metaphors, if I've come out half and I say, oh, let me pause and take a deep breath and rest a little bit, you start sinking back, because there is a constant pull opposing your emergence, and you do nothing, you will get pulled back. And the same for the spirit emerging out of mind, or mind emerging out of life. So the pull is an active thing, sticky tar pulling you back with this weight and denseness. You cannot stop, you cannot pause, you have to keep doing. But in the very fact that it is pulling you and you are pulling away to get out, there is the strain. And the strain is a different experience. It literally tears you apart. As I pull myself out, let's say my arms are out and I pull myself out of the stone or the tar, I'm waist deep in it, my legs being stuck in it, my waist experiences this pull. A part pulling down, a part pulling up, and it's as if I'm being torn. So in the first emergence, my head came out, and as it was pushing out, the strain was in my neck. Then the strain was in my chest. Then the strain was in my waist. And at the last stage, the strain is in my legs, which are still bound. And if you understand the full import of the strain, you recognize how in the emergence there are stages of the strain, which as if tear apart at the boundary where some part has emerged and some part is still bound. When the spiritual consciousness tries to emerge, similarly, there is a strain of something pulling back. Not only the mind is pulling back, life force is pulling back, matter is pulling back, inconscience pulls back. And if you pause, you slide back. This is, of course, a very common experience we have when we try to heal ourselves. You are able to, as if by sustained concentration, overcome some defect, and you feel as if now you're going to get well, and at that point you pause and it pulls back. I can share a personal, relatively recent experience. I found after the age of 43, like clockwork, the sight begins to become more difficult, in the sense that the lens becomes more rigid. Your muscles can be strong, you can exercise them, but the lens is rigid. Or the muscles eventually weaken because you hardly use them now. At some point I said, well, I should be able to correct it by an internal process. So there was a sustained effort every day before going to sleep to consciously relax the eyes and to work on it from an inside-out process. And I found over 3 or 4 weeks, my sight dramatically improved. I was able to see closer, farther, and with greater clarity. And it was at a point where I will say I recovered something like 80% of what I would have what would have been normal in my earlier age. And then I had to travel. I couldn't pay attention to this. There was jet lag and struggles of other types. The body being tired and weak during that struggle of transition of time zones and travel, everything collapsed and was lost in a few days. Now, possibly, if I could have brought it all the way to a certain level of stability, it would have needed less energy to sustain, but it would still need energy to sustain because of this pull of inconscience and ignorance constantly there. But it might have been less because it would have been more stable. But having come to an 80% point, it's like there's a strain of some part still not done, and the moment you let go, everything begins to be pulled down. The nature of the strain was shifting. Initially, it was a strain just to become aware. Later, it was a strain to sustain awareness or intensify awareness, and later on, something else. Now, this idea you will see makes for gradations and degrees, and in each gradation and degree, there's a qualitative difference in the nature of the challenge. That's what makes for these stages, which we will see later on. 3 stages, but within each stage, finer gradations. So against the pull and strains, you can see how Sri Aurobindo is using these words not like a poetic description, but with a precise scientific connotation. Next, what makes this task of emergence more difficult? Third point, the instinctive opposition and obstruction of the inconscience. And then the fourth, and the hampering mixture and blind obstinate retardations of the ignorance. So first the problems which inconscience places, and then the problems which come with ignorance. But first you're struggling in conscience, which is the complete darkness. Then you struggle with ignorance. So what is the problem of inconscience? What does it do? The instinctive opposition and obstruction. So the instinct of inconscience is to oppose. Anything moving, anything changing, oppose. That's the nature of inconscience. So let's say you are now drowned in this ocean of tar, and at that point try to move even a little bit. The stickiness of the tar, if you try to move your hand in any direction, you would have opposition. It's not as if the inconscience says, okay, I will let you move in one direction but not another. I'll let you sink but not rise. It has no preference. Any change it opposes. its very nature is to be rigid. That's the nature of matter, isn't it? Literally, if you're now in the stone, in the image we saw earlier of the carver pulling himself out of stone, you're bound, petrified in stone, no movement, any direction is acceptable or possible. So it has instinctive opposition, and it has the finer other aspect, obstruction. So opposition prevents any movement. You try to move your hand any direction, it blocks it. Obstruction is when it puts a barrier. So if you take the tower experience and you try to push now, okay, you had the initial opposition, but now as you've built up a certain push, it's as if in the very forward push, the layer of tar against which you are pushing becomes more hard. I don't know if you've experienced this. You see this visually in water. When a boat moves rapidly, the water which is in front is lifted up as if compressed and offers a greater resistance, becomes as if harder or larger or higher, more strong in force. If you take certain types of materials like soft paste, if you take wheat, mix it in water and becomes soft paste, if you take it in your fingers and press, you can press softly. But if you leave it on the table and hit hard with your fist, it's almost solid like rock. You push with a little finger and it goes right through. You hit hard and it becomes hard. This particular quality has a term in physics which now slips my mind, but the idea is if you push hard against it, it hardens as if offering a stronger opposition. If you push softly, then it lets you move softly. So this is the character of inconscience, that it obstructs. First it has opposed, but when you have moved, it obstructs, and as if the very fact that you have moved has hardened in the direction of the movement, and that you have to overcome. So this is characterizing the nature of inconscience. Let's say now out of inconscience you have pulled yourself out a little bit, and now you have reached the stage of ignorance. What happens there? And which is the fourth difficulty? The hampering mixture and the hampering mixture and blind obstinate retardations of the ignorance. So again, this also has two aspects. Ignorance first has hampering mixture. In anything you try to do, now you have come into some kind of ignorance, meaning you have half light, more darkness perhaps initially, but half light or quarter light or 1/10 light. The problem is it's 1/10 or quarter or half. It's a mixture. And the very fact that you try to do something with the light you have, not recognizing the mixture in it, makes for the light to be erroneous, limited, even distorted, even falsified. The mixture hampers. The light in me says, oh, I should be doing this. I start making the effort, but the mixture hampers. It creates obstacles. So hampering is not the active obstruction or opposition which you find in inconscience. It's more like barriers over which you trip. You're walking in the jungle, and every time you take a step, you don't realize there is a vine of a root of a tree or a vine of a tree which has hooked into your ankle, and it pulls you back and you trip over it. Or at least if you're conscious enough not to trip, you have to now extricate your leg from it. And you do not know when you swing your arm forward and there's a vine which has got stuck. It hampers. Little things which trip and which pop up as not active opposition but traps which somehow misdirect or limit. So hampering mixture, every time there's a mixture, although you have a light, something in the light mixed hampers. And the second aspect to this is blind, obstinate retardation. Retarding is delaying, slowing down. I want to do this and I start doing, but I can't move swiftly, I can't move rapidly. Something slows down. I don't know why. It's blind. It does not recognize why it slows down. And the root of the slowing down is, of course, the mixture. The fact that it is ignorance, mix of light and darkness. In the darkness are hid elements which slow down, maybe even opposing, but the opposition is hidden, you don't see it obviously. Effectively, it slows down or makes your substance not fluid, not clear. Or because it distracts, you end up going zigzag instead of going straight. And so there's a slowing down. So the retardation is blind. It's not obvious why there is this slowing down, but it is obstinate. You can do anything you like to try to overcome it, but somehow it persists. It does not let go. Now here you have 4 aspects of the difficulty of the emergence pulling out of involution, which have been described at such an essential level that you will see these 4 aspects replicated on all levels of consciousness, because they all emerge out of inconscience and ignorance. So even in your mind, if you want to develop, let's say, the power of memory, you'll find these 4 difficulties. And you can actually map them out. Notice these 4 things. Now you might not bother. You'll say, I don't care what the difficulty is. I'll keep working at it until I get through. But if you recognize the 4 difficulties, you can untangle each one skillfully. And then what will happen will be a release which will be rapid. When we speak of spiritual being emerging out of mental being, consider what these 4 are in relation to spiritual being's emergence. And again, you will get insights and keys of corrective measures that you could take. Or in life, you're trying to develop something. Let's say even it is an objective external activity, a project to be executed. And you find difficulty. Look back at the nature of the difficulty, you will find one or more of these 4 involved. For example, it could be that there is the hold of the medium, which is obscure. Or it could be that there is the pull and strain, which is there from that, which is out of which the new thing is coming out. Or there could be the instinct, there could be the instinctive opposition and obstruction of inconscience, or the hampering mixture, blind, obstinate retardation of ignorance. This could be with circumstances, it could be with people, it could be with organizational structures. You can take this anywhere and apply it anywhere, and you will see these 4 principles operative. When they move to higher levels, you may not use these terms, but it will still be this principle working there. Collectively, individually, in any emergence. Now, having described this, he describes the 4 stages of nature, the 3 stages of nature's emergence. Considering that this is there, these 4 kinds of difficulty are in the very nature of things present. When nature starts coming out, she goes through 3 stages or 3 degrees of her emergence, which he now describes. For each of these stages, we will find also certain elements. So first stage of emergence. Nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. There are then small, half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. Imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta, little packets. This is stage 1 of emergence. Stage 2, we will read the whole thing and then come back and study each. Stage 2, afterwards, there are small or large formations. A more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself. First, partially here and there in a low intensity, then more vivid, more formative. Finally, there is the decisive emergence, a reversal of the consciousness. So this is now entering the third stage. Finally, there is the decisive emergence, a reversal of the consciousness, the beginning of the possibility of its radical change. But still, no, this is still actually part of the middle stage. Okay, it's not third stage yet. The reversal of consciousness, beginning of possibility of radical change. But still much has to be done in every direction. A long and difficult growth towards perfection lies before the evolutionary endeavor. This is still second stage. Now it has come into its own through multiple sub-stages. A third stage comes. The thing done has not only to be confirmed, secured against relapse and downward gravitation, against failure and extinction, but opened out into all the fields of its possibilities, its totality of entire self-achievement, its utmost height, subtlety, riches, wideness. It has to become dominant, all-embracing, comprehensive. That's stage 3. So first stage, you can barely recognize the thing itself. Second stage, you can recognize the thing, but there are multiple sub-stages within it until it comes into its own, but it's weak. Stage 3, it consolidates itself and then develops its full range of possibilities. And then he says, in conclusion at the end of the paragraph, this is everywhere the process of nature. What a statement. Everywhere. No exception. Anywhere you look in nature, this is happening. And to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedure. This is the problem of science. Science documents the procedure after procedure, and then there is a complex maze in which you get lost. And having described the procedure, we say, now we understand how this happens. But we don't understand why it happens. And the real intention of nature is the why. If you could understand the intention, then the procedure is secondary. In fact, once nature has decided to do something, she will find, if not one procedure, another, and if not another, a third. The procedure itself is not important. That's why he calls it a maze. The way it works, nature pushes this way. If it doesn't work, she pushes that way. If it doesn't work, she pushes third way. And meanwhile, she consolidates the push of first and second to unite with the third to make for something. In the way, and we are told this quite proudly by evolutionary scientists, that the appearance of the I in nature is a very complex process. It involves 13 distinct stages, piling one upon the other, all of them useless in themselves, and in the 14th step, suddenly you have a working eye. How does nature do it? And the evidence through fossil study is that nature has rebuilt the eye not once but at least 4 times in different ways, and sometimes with very different kinds of eyes. As you see in the bee, a compound eye which is very different from our eye. All of them involving similarly multiple stages, all useless in themselves, and then suddenly a working eye. And the evolutionary biologists will proudly say, yeah, the very fact that nature has done it at least 4 times, or is it 6 times, I think now, 6 times, shows you that it's not a big deal. No, it is not an evidence that it's not a big deal. It shows you that nature can do it in many different ways, but it is still a big deal. How do you explain that 13 stages, all useless in themselves, lead magically to a 14th step that makes for a working eye? You don't explain it. Just because you see it happening more frequently doesn't mean that it's not easily explained. It is still not explained. So, this is the problem. We get lost in the maze of her procedure. And the maze of her procedure can be so complex. I remember discussing this with the cellular biologist. They were describing how the single cell manufactures certain specific proteins. And proteins can be such complex and long chains that building them, assembling them to make for that final product is so complicated. If you make a chart on paper and a really small chart of a printout, this step combining with that, joining with that, you get this literally a maze of steps and combinations. It'll be like a meter high and spread several meters long. You'll have a complex, detailed drawing of stages leading to the final manufacture of the protein. And all this is happening in every single cell of your body automatically, as if instinctively. And this is for just one protein. And there are many different kinds of proteins and peptides which are being made, complex amino acid chains which are being manufactured, and all of them coordinated by some intelligence. Because when the cell is defective in something, it automatically increases the boost of production of something else to counter the first problem. So there's an intelligence coordinating all these activities. And if you ignore the intention, you get lost in the maze. If instead you capture the intention, you don't worry too much about the actual processes that nature used, because she can find other processes. And the maze in itself is not too important. This was the approach of the ancient yogis. And Sri Aurobindo observes how, because they took such an approach, the inner knowledge being more obvious to them, the outer specifics of nature's process were secondary. And they didn't think it worth entering into that kind of detailed information which you see in current modern science. And that is the justification of the extreme materialism in which modern science is born. In that extreme materialism, it cannot accept that there is an intention of nature. Everything has to be mechanical. And so the study and the detailed study of the complexity of nature's processes has been the highlight of the work. And it has gone so deep as never before in human history. So it's as if one could justify the obsessive, exaggerated materialism just for this benefit of having gone deep into matter in this way. Otherwise, the moment you see the other side and the intention of nature, and you recognize the maze is not so important, push the intention and she'll create a new pattern in the maze. So why bother with the specific steps? Rather, work on the pushing of the intention, highlight, intensify the component of energy of prana, direct the prana and infuse into it the intention of mind, of mana, and you will have the outcome. Why bother with the specifics of material steps? We would not have gone so deep into this material exploration. So this is all to consolidate the big picture of what Sri Aurobindo has described. And now we look at the 3 stages. And as you can see, within each stage, Sri Aurobindo has described multiple components. I'm using the word deliberately because sometimes it's not obviously a stage, but a facet in the stage, especially in the beginning. Later you find in the second stage multiple sub-stages and components within each of these. So let's look at first step. Nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. Now there's a semicolon. Second aspect to this stage. There are then small, half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. Imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. And again you see multiple degrees within that. Okay, all of this makes for stage 1. So let's look at it all in greater detail. First step, nature affirms a vague urge and tendency at first. So this affirming is nature making firm, pushing forward. What? The form of it may be vague urge and tendency, but it is really the submerged reality being pushed forward to the surface. That's what's really happening. There is a surface largely built of the appearance of the medium. Let's say it was matter. Or it was life force, or it was mind. But behind, deeper within, hidden, is the greater reality. That reality she takes and now firms up and pushes forward towards the surface. This is the sum total of it. Now we look at the nuances. Nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push. There's an urge, but you can't say what it is. It's so vague you can't even recognize what it is, but you see something is pushing. If you look at today, at humanity, in various ways, various aspects of the working, in humanity there are vague urges of all kinds. And because they are vague, you do not see where they are going. One of the things which you can recognize now looking back over the last 30 years, there was a vague urge in humanity to take charge of its own health, to pull itself out of this dependence on old habits, nature processes, biological processes. Some of it was tied at first to just getting cured. I am sick, give me a tablet, get cured. But you see, the urge itself was, don't make me change my lifestyle. Give me a tablet and I'll get cured. I still want to live my life the way I want. The attempt was, I have created a lifestyle which is already broken away from nature and therefore made me sick. But I don't want to go back to the dependence on nature. I want to live that new lifestyle which I have created. And just because it makes me sick doesn't mean I should go back into a dependence. Rather, I'm going to take out from nature this knowledge of the tablet or the medicine, pop it in my mouth, and somehow be able to live as I want. Now, if you saw it in its original stage, you would have said, oh, this is just some kind of inertia. Humanity it's breaking out of its natural groove and getting into these perversions, and then it is so lazy to not want to go back to its natural living. But if you see the form of the urge, it's actually something else. It's trying to get free of nature's rhythm and law. It's trying to reach a stage of mastery where it can say, I can do what I want and not fall sick. Then you see how, in that initial movement, it took a different form. There were those health freaks. They use the word freaks, literally. In all the writings in the journals, you will say, health freak, are you a health freak? So-and-so is a health freak. Freak being you are like a aberration, abnormal. These health freaks, they will drink these special juices of wheat grass. What a weird thing. You laugh at them. These health freaks, they go and exercise every day. What a crazy stuff. Why would you want to exercise every day? I exercise only when the doctor tells me I need to get well, and then I stop my exercise when I'm well. Exercise is only a therapy to get well, right? And that's their lifestyle. This fellow runs 10 kilometers every day. Freak. What do you see today? Everybody wants to somehow incorporate elements of exercise, but with the same original urge being to get free of nature's limitation, but using her methods in the exercise. The exercise are designed to amplify certain things of nature itself, using asanas, using pranayam, using other modalities, and you have all kinds of specialized techniques and approaches, including, resistance training, where you don't move at all. So for example, you want to strengthen your neck muscles, you can of course go left, right, unendingly, or you put your palm and push against your palm. There's a tension of the muscles. Nothing moves. There's a word for it, this kind of exercise. Isometric, I think it's called. Isometric exercise. So nothing moves, but you're strengthening the muscles. You can be sitting and doing exercise without seeming to move at all, just by tensing and then relaxing. But tensing both sides, or opposing one side as you tense the other. Somebody puts his hands on your shoulders and you push up. Nothing moves, and yet the exercise is made. And so there are many approaches, many facets of the attempt to improve yourself, none of this you could have recognized in that original first urge that you saw. So at first, nature affirms a vague urge and tendency. The tendency was a direction. Urge and tendency, Sri Aurobindo has used two words. In the first case, there's an urge where you do not see direction. Something is pushing me. I need to do something, I don't know what. I need to eat something, I don't know what. Something is wrong with my life, I need to change it, I don't know what. So the urge does not have a direction. Out of that urge comes a tendency which has a direction. I crave for more fresh foods. That's a tendency now. I need to change my lifestyle. I need time for myself, to have me time, which is quality time for my own growth. Tendency. But in the initial urge, you could not see which direction it would go. So, if the urge further is vague, then it's even more difficult to recognize. All you see is a restlessness. But you cannot even say that there's an urge. Something is preparing. I don't even know what. And then it forms into an urge, which is more formed urge but no direction. And then it takes direction, it becomes tendency. So nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, and is putting all these into one general movement, although you could look at all the nuances, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. Now again, three words describing this push of the reality towards the surface. The reality which was buried in this involution is now coming to the surface. In the emergence to the surface, you do not see the reality, but you see its push. So an analogy would be, let's say your palm is underwater. Now you rapidly bring it towards the surface. What happens? You're pushing the water, which is against your palm, which pushes the water above it, which pushes the water above it. And on the surface of the pond, lake, or swimming pool, you'll see a bulge of water. That's the urge or tendency. But you do not know what is pushing. You do not know how far it is. You only see its effect. It's only when the palm comes close enough that you can see through the water and you say, it is that thing which is pushing, trying to come out. And it's only when it's half out that you can say, now I can see the form of the palm. And when it comes out fully, it can seize upon the water and play and modify it. It has come into its own. It's free. This is that movement, submerged reality towards the surface, pushing. But how deep is it? And especially if it's coming out of the inconscience and ignorance, it's so dark, you can see nothing. But he uses three words to describe that reality: occult, subliminal, submerged. And they represent 3 degrees of perception of that reality. When it is occult, it is completely hidden. You do not even know it's there, or if someone tells you it's there, you have no way of verifying. Do you know that within you are occult powers? Oh yeah? Show me. I don't know, I don't see them. Someone performs a miracle and they say, this power exists in all of you. Oh yeah, I don't see it. That's occult. Out of that occult, when it pushes forward sufficiently its influence, that you can feel the push, then you say it is subliminal. The limb is the lit up part, subliminal is behind or below the lit up part. So I'm conscious, but I sense this thing pushing in me. I feel as if I try to turn my attention to feel what might happen tomorrow, I get a vague feeling that I might be able to know it. I should be able to know what's going to happen, whether I'll have a good day or a bad day. And at that point, you sense the power which was occult. It is subliminal. And then the power begins to act. Every day, I look at the day ahead of me and I try to feel what might happen. And I sense, I'm going to have some difficulty today. Today is going to be smooth. I sense the qualitative feel of what it might be like. And at that point, it is submerged power. It's below. I don't have direct access to it, but its influence is strong enough. So, whenever in nature there is this movement, nature affirms a vague urge and tendency which is a sign of the push of occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. It's going to go through these three stages. Right now, everything in us is occult. Very little is subliminal, and even less is submerged. But in the submerged part in us, we are already beginning to recognize certain tendencies. One of the tendencies in the submerged part, in impulse from within, in humanity, is the need to widen the horizon of knowledge, of experience. Everybody spontaneously reaches out and craves to know more, experience more, understand more. And so we build vehicles, means of that experience, because it's interesting, we need it. And one of the most powerful means has become now the access to videos from across the world, and most easily in your hand through the mobile phone. You can look at anything, any place, any experience, any person, any lecture, presentation of ideas, and it's all there available to you. And people want as if to reach out to widen. And so this need, this tendency towards widening is a submerged thing. We are not yet conscious that that's what we want, but it's obvious enough that that's what is happening. Behind that deeper subliminal are other urges, which we could take the earlier example of the need to overcome our own limitations, to assert our will against the body's incapacity or the mind's dullness. That is still submerged. And occult, of which we are not even aware, are enormous powers, including powers of perception, of direct sight, clairvoyance, clairaudience, telepathy, and so on. Those are still largely occult. They have not yet come into the realm that is subliminal. Now, Sri Aurobindo has used one more word which we have not fully explored. He says, nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the reality towards the surface. The sign. And sign, at first, everything is seen through signs. And the signs can be various. They can be different in different cultures, in different stages of development also. The signs may vary even person to person. One thing which I see everywhere in young children is, and you can see this as a sign, they're willing to explore. They're not afraid to make mistakes in their exploration, and sometimes this can be dangerous. And so they are vulnerable also to being misused. But you can see this kind of a foolhardiness as a sign of a deeper courage or a deeper force which is perhaps preparing. But in its appearance, it is not that. That's why it's a sign, symbol. So a sign is not the thing itself, but it's a representation in a different medium, a lesser medium, in an inferior or distorted form. So there are many signs. So when you look at the sky, the color of the sky is a sign that it might rain. It's not the rain, you do not see the rain. But the color, they say evening, bright, reddish sky is a sign that there might be rain. Now, we can rationalize it that in the atmosphere there is a lot of dust which scatters the light, makes it more reddish. The dust particles in the atmosphere become nuclei around which the moisture can condense and therefore cause rain. That may be the scientific thought justifying this observation. But in the sign you do not see the rain at all. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the sign is deceptive. But still it's a sign of a possibility attempting which may fail. So whenever there's this push from within, there are signs on the surface. And Sri Aurobindo is saying that if we do not observe the true nature of this movement, if we do not understand it truly, to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedure. So he's literally teaching us how nature works, how she thinks, how she acts, and revealing all her secrets. You will not find anywhere in any writing this kind of penetrating vision and insight and laying bare all the secrets of nature. Like I said, these observations actually have implications not only in the spiritual emergence, not only in the psychological development, not only in energy of life force emerging out of matter, it has implications in material evolution, that is, in physical science even. All of these things represent physical processes at the same time. So this he has described the first stage. No, not yet. So we're not yet complete. This is first description, semicolon. Now the second part of the first stage comes in. There are then small, half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. Imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. Now in this you can see finer stages actually. When first this sign has come and the movement has started, there are then, only after that stage has happened, sub-stage of step 1, there are then small half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. Small half-suppressed hints. First of all, they are hints, they are not the thing itself. They hint at a possibility that this might happen. The hint itself is half-suppressed, held back because of the nature of the medium. It's not fully suppressed, otherwise it wouldn't be hint at all. It wouldn't be visible. It's visible, but it's held back. And so you can't quite see the force and the direction of the force because it's half suppressed. And it's very small. It's so small that it's easy to miss. It appears to be insignificant. There's so much more happening in the youth today. They are so excitable. They are playing in this and that. These are the new forms of music. These are the new activities. These are new adventure sports. You're missing you've lost yourself in the maze of nature's procedure. You're missing her intention. Through all these adventures, through all these crazy kinds of behavior, is this deeper, subtle, quiet impulse to become free, to experiment with things, to widen the horizon, in preparation to a greater mastery where you should be able to do everything without fear. And that hint is lost in the activity and the forms. So you will see today school children are taken in school outings where they go bungee jumping or river rafting or rock climbing and all kinds of things which earlier we would not have done. You were limited to your little playground and the scope that was offered with the gymnasium that you could build if you were wealthy enough. This is far bigger. And sometimes it's not even that they do all this, sometimes they watch all this and internalize it. But still, it is this broadening of the horizon and they're yearning for it. If you tell them, sorry, you cannot do all that, they feel so restricted, they rebel. There you have your sign. So, there are then small half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. The half-suppressed is the suggestion that if you try to block it, it will rebel. So notice in all these tendencies, you try to block, there's a rebellion, you know behind it there's a sign of something more deep. And as a result, because it is half suppressed and small, he describes all the fine steps. Imperfect beginnings. You're starting something which is so imperfect that you cannot even see what it is. Even when it takes on some form, it is so warped that again you can say it is wrong, it is bad for them to do it. Crude elements. The child has coarseness, crudeness in those activities. Rudimentary appearances. The form is very basic. Small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. A quanta is a small quantity or a small step, but which cannot be reduced further. This is the idea of quanta. When they say quantum leap, it's a jump of which there is no intermediate. So it's not the question of small, you can have large quanta also, but it's the aspect of the fixity of the quanta which cannot be further reduced. But generally the association of quanta is small steps but which are jumps and not continuums. So small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. Now if you think about this, I have applied it to the context of this example. Apply this now to the big picture of what we have discussed before. Remember, we were discussing nature's 4 lines of development of the inner awakening: religion, occultism, spiritual thought, and direct experience. Now, look at all this in these 4 streams, 4 lines of development. What happened when first religion began? First, there was this nature affirming a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. How was that? Perhaps in a very crude humanity, a sense of awe or fear, and you feel the sense of the sacred through that. But in its initial form, small half-suppressed hint of what is to be, imperfect beginning, crude elements, you have the awe which takes on a form of fear. And even it seems to be not healthy. It's crude. As a result of fear, the person pulls back. There is lightning, we shiver in fear. What is that great power? What if it were to strike us? And occasionally we see it strike the tree. And so there is a rudimentary appearance, small, insignificant. You would never realize that all this is a preparation for the sense of a sacred communion with the divine. So before it can even get to that, there is the recognition of something greater and a power. And then out of that, something will happen which will be more recognizable, which will be in the second stage, when it will recognize, oh, now there is a reverence towards a greater power. And then eventually a communion, because you feel the intimacy and even the sense of oneness with that greater divinity. But at this point where it has happened, it was like a sudden thing clicking in. Quanta. Small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta has come in. It's there, it was not there. A leap made. So this is stage 1. Afterwards, recognizable quality begins to show itself. That's stage 2. So we have gone into some detail in this, and I just want us to reabsorb all the nuances in reading this sentence all over again. What is stage 1 of the emergence? Nature affirms at first a vague urge and tendency, which is a sign of the push of the occult, subliminal, submerged reality towards the surface. There are then small, half-suppressed hints of the thing that is to be. Imperfect beginnings, crude elements, rudimentary appearances, small, insignificant, hardly recognizable quanta. If you look at some of the forms of religion earlier, the crude elements and rudimentary appearances were what put off the modern mind. Sometimes those crude elements have survived religions also after many centuries. Sometimes they've been cleaned out. A good example you see today is the difference between Christianity and Islam, which have common roots. Islam, in fact, considers Christ as one of its prophets, Muhammad being the last. But teachings of Christ are acceptable, except where overridden by the Quran. But The difference, though, is Christianity, having had all of its crude elements becoming even exaggerated during a certain dark period, it went through a kind of a cleaning out through the phase of enlightenment. As a result, it removed those crude and coarse elements. Some still stick, which are elements key to the control of the church, for example. But even those inevitably have to be cleaned out, because otherwise the church loses its hold on people, humanity evolves, the religion breaks down. So religions have to keep up if they have to maintain relevance. But the cleaning out has happened in a very significant way. Those crude elements are mostly gone. In Islam, though, you find the struggle today. There is an Islam which clings to those crude elements, and there is an Islam which has refined itself and come into its own as a more mature form of the teaching. It prides itself even on its purity and universality, and so it calls itself Sufi, the pure, clear, true, even the sense of that. And so I have often met people who declare themselves Sufi and those who call themselves Muslim, and the two will enter into a conversation. The Muslim will say, what are you? How are you different from Muslim? Are you Muslim or not? And the Sufi says, yes, I am Muslim, but I am Sufi. How is that different? And they have a struggle to formulate without seeming to be superior. But this is the fact that Sufism has given to itself a form of universality and clarity which has not been articulated by those who are still bound to mixed forms. Salafism, for example, is one of the schools, as well as more other coarser forms, where the form of punishment, brutality of order of killing people who do not follow certain strictures or formulas are so crude as to be barbaric. And they try to enforce that. They try to push that all over the world, and there's a pushback in elements which are sufficiently refined to say, we do not want this. And you see the struggle between the two tendencies. And it's interesting to see and recognize how painful the struggle can be, how much suffering it might involve. Every religion which has had these kinds of coarser beginnings has passed through such struggle without exception. Because that's human nature and not the problem of the religion itself. Human nature is what forms the religion or gives to it form which correspond to its need. So this is how you would understand many elements of religion. Turn now this to occultism, and you'll see again the same idea. Superstition being the origin of occultism. A repeated pattern seen and recognized, which then gets organized into a knowledge, which then becomes a more profound knowledge until the knowledge comes into its own and you have a skill to develop itself. Same with religion. Once it comes into its own, it has a skill to formulate and restate itself in higher terms. In the early forms which are more coarse of shamanism, there will be a kind of a connection felt with some spirit or being or presence or underlying reality and power of nature. But once the occultist has come into its own, he is literally able to stand back, often with a deeper spiritual component, stand back upon the occult ranges and then be able to formulate and chart out the knowledge and processes. And the coarse and crude elements can be cleaned out. And the same with spiritual philosophy. The same also with experience. Any emergent spiritual experience can have all of these elements. Again, I can draw on a very common experience I have. Often meeting young children in families which have a spiritual inclination, and the children are going through some great struggle. Only recently, I take this example because it's quite fresh. A person who in his family has entered even being treated with psychiatric medicine because he has convinced himself, or rather the society and family have convinced him, that he has a severe depression and that he has major insecurities and psychological problems for which he needs to be treated. And so I asked, well, what is it? He said, I've always had insecurity. What kind of insecurity? When I meet strangers, I find it difficult to speak. I said, show me one human being who's never had that problem. So he describes all of his problems, and each one I say, show me someone who's not had them. So he says, yeah, but I have them in such an exaggerated way that it's a psychiatric problem. Okay, so show me someone who has not had it in the origin in which you had. In your case, perhaps it's become exaggerated. So I said, okay, what is the form of exaggeration? He says, to me, money doesn't make sense. Everybody else says, make money. What are you doing with your business? You're not making more money. He says, what does it mean to make money? Why should I want to make money? And I said to him, I don't see any problem with that. There are those types who value the money part. There are those types who value the experience or knowledge part. And you value that to a point where the money is irrelevant to you. He says, yeah, that's true. So I said, where's your problem? So going through the whole discussion over a span of an hour, we came to the conclusion that he had no problem. And that he was just a misfit in the values which were projected upon him through society. In fact, this was my recognition, I don't know, he came to that point on his own recognition or not, that there was something within him which was deeply spiritual, yearning for the spiritual. But it had this character, a vague urge and tendency of this push, of something deeper wanting to come forward. And there is a part of him that says that I don't need to be disturbed. I don't need to be in a state of agitation all the time. I prefer to be in a poise of calm, equality in everything I do. And somehow people around him say, unless you're agitated and all the time thinking, you're not doing something. And so he's tried to put himself in that state of agitation, which is what made him sick to begin with. And then I met him after a few days. He says, after that meeting, after the discussion, suddenly I find myself in the state of calm. And my thoughts are calm and clear. I'm not disturbed anymore. And I'm worried that I'm not agitated. I said, no, that's a better foundation. You have to be more true to yourself. You're more rooted in you rather than in the fake form and appearance. But in all this, while he was not so conscious and I couldn't say it in these open terms, was this spiritual seed that was pushing forward to flower out. And what is seen is, you see, the hint, the sign of the push is so clear. Half suppressed hints of the thing to be, rudimentary appearances, hardly recognizable, insignificant, but it's now significant enough that he accepts, yes, I prefer to be in this poise of equality. I'm giving this as an example because I've seen similar things in many young children. And unfortunately, those who have this are often damaged by the social circumstances which are contrary to their spiritual urge. And if not sufficiently addressed, they can be if not sufficiently or early enough addressed, they can be misled into thinking they have a problem and even pulled into this, as in this case, psychiatric medication, which is utterly contrary to what is needed. But this is happening more and more. And what I understand from this picture is, out there in the collective space, there is the need for a clear articulation of these tendencies and what they truly represent. But because they are such vague tendencies, if you say every time you feel some urge like this, it's a spiritual urge, people may not recognize it. Or there can be an imitation of it. But I would say even if it's an imitation, it still indicates that there's something which is a misfit, something deeper trying to push forward. But afterwards, and now we come to level 2, afterwards there are small or large formations, semicolon, that's sub-step. And then a more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself first partially, here and there, or in a low intensity, then more vivid, more formative. Finally, there's the decisive emergence, reversal of consciousness. But it's not come into its own to become fully stable. It's not yet expanded itself into its rich possibilities. So here we are in stage 2, you're able to see formations, then you're able to see qualities, and then you're able to see the thing in itself. These are 3 sub-steps of stage 2. In the first place, there's small or large formations. Why does he say small or large? Well, in many cases it happens that there's one small or many small formations. Or the one thing can come up and become one large formation. In the example which I have just narrated, there was the element of equality which was there. There was a complete difference of attitude, of relationship towards money, a different value system of what is valuable and what is not. There was also a certain natural tendency towards following a movement of enjoying, a deep enjoyment of doing things which give deeper satisfaction. And they were all different things, each of them small in themselves. But sometimes it can happen to a person that it comes in one big large thrust. That suddenly now there is a yearning for an aspect, and then there's a push. And then a more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself. Now you can say, this is what it is. It's a tendency for equality. That is a tendency for seeking a deeper satisfaction of the psychic values. You can recognize that. Not obviously to everybody, not even obviously to that person. But to someone who has experienced that, you can feel the resonance and say, yes. So that's why he says, when that happens, begins to a more characteristic and recognizable quality begins to show itself, first partially, here and there, or in a low intensity, then more vivid, more formative. So there is intensity which can grow, or it can be fragmented, from which it can come out more strongly. You see, the wording so accurately captures all possible nuances of the experience. And it becomes more vivid, more formative. And then sub-step 3. Finally, there is the decisive emergence, a reversal of consciousness, the beginning of the possibility of its radical change. We have not yet had radical change. Possibility of radical change. Because obviously the person says, I live in this equality. I want to live by these values of my psychic aspiration or the joy that comes with it. That has come distinctly into its own. But possibility of a radical change. Still much to be done in every direction. Long and difficult growth towards perfection lies before the evolutionary endeavor. That's stage 2 completing. Then stage 3, it comes into its own, affirms, confirms, secures against relapse, opens out to all its possibilities, full achievement, height, subtlety, riches, wideness. So all this we will see next time. Stage 2 itself has certain elements in this third nuance. The reversal of consciousness, decisive emergence, etc., which we will look at next time, and then move to the stage 3. All of this we can, as an exercise, apply to how religions have emerged, how occultism has developed, how spiritual philosophy has developed. But the fourth line of development is our own spiritual experience. And in that we will recognize all these stages and all these nuances. Every one of us has had them. If nothing else, in early childhood, there were elements which now you can turn upon and say, yes, that was the first beginning of a spiritual nudge, aspiration, sensitivity of some kind. And now you can look back and see what it was. And because now you can see what it was in your own life, you recognize that in the lives of other children, while they are not yet capable of recognizing. And then we would describe it in terms of those 4 statements which I spoke earlier. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep, wake him. So you see in a child this tendency, but he's not conscious that it's a spiritual aspiration and tendency, wake him. Speak to him or make him aware of the value of this, and make him value it and pursue it and hold as his reference. And if we can give that as a gift to young children in their emergence, and if they follow that line of reference of the inner influence of the experience, then they will save themselves needlessly so much struggle. So you see, this knowledge, in conclusion, is so detailed, so complete, and so universal in application that he concludes at the end of the paragraph, this is everywhere the process of nature, and to ignore it is to miss the intention in her works and get lost in the maze of her procedure. So we'll continue this text next time with the third step of the second stage. And we can meditate on this and perhaps take this as a theme of introspection for our own lives, and perhaps notice these things in things around us, in people, in circumstances, and even in collective trends in society, in humanity, over the coming week in preparation for a deeper exploration.